Noon, everybody. Today is Monday, April 19th, 2021, and I am Andrew Cohen. I direct the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics at Georgia State University, and I also teach in the philosophy department there. Today's event is part of the continuing Spring 2021 Speaker Series, sponsored by the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics. That series is Ethical Dialogues Across the Virtual University, Multidisciplinary Perspectives. We've brought multiple distinguished scholars virtually to our campus community and fostered rich conversation about the ethical themes in their work. And before we begin with the introduction for today's special guest, I'd like to promote the upcoming talk later this week on Wednesday, April 21st at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Professor Jennifer Morton from the lovely University of North Carolina will visit to discuss Resisting Pessimism Traps, the Limits of Epistemic Resilience. That's this Wednesday, April 21st at 1 p.m. All registration information is available at ethics.gsu.edu. On to today's speaker. To introduce our speaker, I now turn things over to Professor Juan Pineros Glasscock. Juan.
Thanks, Andrew. Welcome, everybody. I am so excited about today's event. I'm just going to give kind of a brief introduction. So my students have read some of Hitz's work, which we studied in the context of the great debate between Du Bois and Alain Locke on the function of art. What I want to do is kind of give just an introduction as to Zena Hitz and her work and kind of where it stems from if you read her book, Lost in Thought. And then just say a little bit about what the format of the event is going to be, and then we'll just get going with the talk, which I know is what everybody's waiting for. So Professor Hitz completed her BA at St. John's College in Annapolis, and then she went on to do graduate work on ancient philosophy at the University of Cambridge, the University of Chicago, and eventually went on to do her PhD at Princeton University. And as you'll know from her book, it was while she was working on her PhD that 9/11 happened. This was as she was finishing the program at Princeton, and the event, as with many people, had a transformative effect on her, raising the question, what are we doing as students and scholars engaging in intellectual pursuits like philosophy when there are all these injustices and evils in the real world that are in need of correction? And I think this is a question that is as pressing today as it was then. And an immediate effect that this had on Hitz was that she changed her focus of her work in ancient philosophy from views on self-knowledge to working on ancient political theory. And then as her academic trajectory continued, where she published several important scholarly papers on ancient philosophy, and she held academic appointments at Auburn University, McGill University, and the University of Maryland, Hitz eventually takes a hiatus from academic life. And I'm actually not going to tell you what happened in the interim because it's part of the narrative of her book, Lost in Thought. And I don't want to ruin what's an excellent story. Let me say about what the book is about because, and kind of what Hitz's work has been since then. So the book constitutes, in a way, the culmination of Hitz's reflections on the value of intellectual work as it happened during this hiatus. And it constitutes a defense of the classical view that intellectual pursuits have intrinsic value, that they should be pursued for their own sake, and that we generally do harm to this value if we try to subsume it or reduce it to political or worse, business values. Now, if you're acquainted with the kind of defense that this kind of view has received in classical work, for instance, in Plato and Aristotle, you will know that the charge of elitism is not out of place. So both Plato and Aristotle seem to have thought of the intellectual man generally, as being able to pursue their work on the basis of a societal system are organized around the hierarchy where other people would do the manual labors, and then they could kind of spend their lives intellectualizing. But I think it's one of the most distinctive and strongest and most interesting aspects of Hitz's argument in the book that she recognizes the value of such pursuits in the lives of everybody. And she calls attention to the wonderful intellectual achievements of office and hard labor workers, emperors, novelists, and prisoners alike. Indeed, Hitz argues that the value of intellectual work as it is pursued in the university cannot be divorced from the value of reading groups, birdwatcher groups, and amateur stargazers. So far from a call to intellectual elitism, the book constitutes a challenge to the elitistic understanding of intellectual work. I have to acknowledge that I'm only about halfway through the book, but I already kind of recommend it highly enough. I was very lucky to have parents who always supported me in my academic choices. But my dad actually recently revealed to me that he was worried when he learned that I wanted to major in philosophy. What was I going to do with that? And this was a very well-meaning question, I think, but it betrays deep-seated assumptions about education and its value, which has seen education as a mere instrument for production, or in some cases, activism. And these are assumptions that permeate the narratives and the way in which we think about education and universities nowadays. Assumptions that are important for students to confront and for ourselves as scholars. There are also the kind of tacit assumptions that philosophical gadflies since Socrates have perennially called into question. And I am very thankful for the opportunity today to call them into question together, guided by Professor Zena Hitz. With that, please join me in welcoming her as she presents on the uses of useless learning. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to do something a little different in this talk, a little bit of a twist on the thing that you've read and what Professor Glasscock just said. I'm going to tell some stories, and the stories are about, I think almost all of them about activists of one kind or another, but about the type of education that they had. And I'll make an argument about what I think the core of that education consisted in. So I mean it to be consistent with my other claims that education is for its own sake. It's not to be understood as for the sake of business objectives or even for the sake of justice. But I thought this angle would be an interesting one, and I thought I'd test it out on you guys. I'm very happy to be at Georgia State, anyway, I'm looking forward to hearing your reaction, so I won't talk for too long. The stories may be, some of them very familiar to you, and others may not be, but I'll just toss them all out so that there's some common ground for our conversation. So the first one is this, Malcolm Little. They're all true stories today. So sometimes I use fiction, but these are all true. Malcolm Little grew up in Michigan in the 1920s and 30s. In his childhood, his angry and defiant father was murdered by white men. His family was dissolved by the local welfare office. He was the highest achieving student in his all-white class. But because of his skin color, his teacher suggested that he become a carpenter or a janitor rather than the lawyer that he aspired to be. Angry and defiant like his father, he immersed himself in the hustles of New York City and Boston, selling drugs, procuring women, playing the numbers. He was arrested for theft in the year 1946 and sent to prison for, I think, 9 years. His prison was primitive, had a bucket for a toilet, and his drug habit was fed by the hustling prison officers when he arrived. In prison, he met a polymath, a guy who'd read everything, named John Elton Bembry, who was steeped in culture and history and who could hold forth on a variety of fascinating topics. On his advice, Malcolm began to read first the dictionary, then books on etymology and linguistics. He studied elementary Latin and German. He converted to Islam, taking the name Malcolm X. Islam was introduced to him by his brothers. In the following years, he read the Bible, the Quran, Western philosophers, Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, Spinoza, Kant, as well as works of Asian philosophy. He pored over an especially loved book of archaeological wonders of the East and West. He learned the history of colonialism, of slavery, and of African peoples. He felt his old ways of thinking, these are his words, disappear like snow off a roof. He filled his letters with poetry, writing to his brother, "I'm a real bug for poetry. When you think back over all of our past lives, only poetry could best fit into the vast emptiness created by men." He described his time in prison in another letter as a blessing in disguise, for it provided me with the solitude that produced many nights of meditation. Once he left prison, Malcolm X became a minister in the Nation of Islam, gathering fame as a clear and forceful voice for Black American communities, beaten down by poverty and the violence that was nurtured in racial prejudice. His profuse stream of public speeches masked a disciplined inwardness, as I understand it, a constant struggle to see things as they were and to commit himself accordingly. So over time, he came to reject the anti-white teachings of the nation and underwent a second conversion to the broader humanism of Orthodox Islam. The culmination of the second conversion was a pilgrimage to Mecca, where he saw the stone house at the center of the great mosque. It was being circulated by thousands upon thousands of praying pilgrims, both sexes and every size, shape, color, and race in the world. The change of mind inspired by this vision cost him his life. He was killed by members of his former community. But his murderers seems were aided by US officials who viewed the anti-white cast of his first conversion as a threat. So he staked his life, as I see it, on both of his major changes of mind and lost it twice over. So one of the young men inspired by Malcolm X's teaching and the witness of his life was Huey Newton, as he grew up in Oakland, California. Newton's older brother, Melvin, read and discussed poetry with Huey, much of which he learned by heart, just by ear. Despite that, Newton was a defiant student in his formal schooling. On his own account, he came close to finishing high school, largely illiterate. He decided to educate himself using his brother's books from college. And he began, the first book he picked up was Plato's Republic, which he read with a dictionary. It took him several months, and then he started it over again. He read it 7 or 8 times. This is his account of his education, until he felt he mastered it. Years later, while on trial for the murder of a police officer, a charge with which it seems he was framed under false reports, he spoke to the jury in the courtroom of how he saw in the image of Plato's cave a vision of his own people in need of liberation. So I'm going to pause here and make a comment and ask you a question that you can pore over for a bit, and then I'll come back to you at the end and see. So Plato's Cave, if you've ever opened up Plato's Republic, it's one page out of hundreds. There's 10 trillion topics in there. There's a theory of art. There's a theory of education. There's an account of justice. There's an account of individual morality. There's political theory. There's metaphysics. There's a theory of knowledge. There's a theory of mathematics. Anything under the sun. It's all in Plato's Republic. So did he read all of those 7 or 8 times through Plato's Republic? In what sense is that connected to that speech that he gives in the courtroom, where he says, I saw in Plato's cave that my people needed liberation? That's question one. I'm going to continue my talk, and then if you want to comment on it, come back to me. So just as Malcolm X had followers in as far as being a Black American who educated himself with books, he was hardly the first one. He's part of a long tradition that began under slavery. So Frederick Douglass received lessons in how to read while enslaved. He received them from his mistress, who was from another country and so not acquainted yet with the strictures of slavery. But the master caught them both, and they were both punished for the crime of her teaching him to read. As little education as he got, he had caught the bug of learning. So he taught himself in secret, quizzing schoolboys in competitive games, finding and deciphering random bits of letter, word, or text. At last, a copy of the Columban Orator, which was an anthology of oratory from Greece and Rome, fell into his hands. He read it backwards and forwards and developed for himself the oratorial tones that made him famous also as an activist and an orator. There is, of course, a much more famous story on a much larger scale, and without the benefits of literacy or the ability to read, strictly speaking. The slave masters taught the Bible to enslaved people. They did so in expectation that they would receive it in a servile spirit. That is, that they would learn to obey and learn their place and learn to suffer and to endure. But its central story of the people of Israel led out of Egypt and slavery into freedom was recognized as a human story, as applying in principle to their own situation. So by legend, the great conductor on the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, was called Moses, and she sang spirituals such as Go Down Moses or Steal Away to call her people to the journey north out of slavery. After the Civil War, the Black Americans who were able to receive education received, and this is analogous to what was true of white Americans, either classical education in Greek and Latin classics, or vocational education, job training, or some mix of the two. So Anna Julia Cooper was a great advocate of the classics for Black Americans, especially for women. And in an 1890 paper on the higher education of women, she described its hoped for effects in the following way. So this is Cooper talking. As the sun goes down into the charmed circle of friendship, she may gather the best the world has known. She can commune with Socrates about the daimon he knew, and to which she too can bear witness. She can revel in the majesty of Dante, the sweetness of Virgil, the simplicity of Homer, the strength of Milton. Here at last can be friendship without suspicion, friendship without misunderstanding, love without jealousy. So the story of the use of books in the self-education and self-liberation of oppressed peoples is not, of course, limited to Black Americans. So in the reading that you read, the piece of my paper, I talk about the work of historian Jonathan Rose, who tells of grassroots intellectual movements that swept the British working classes beginning in the late 18th century and going into the 20th. Working people formed associations to fight for better working conditions as part of the labor movement. But such associations included efforts to learn, to study, and to know. They read classics mostly once they were translated, so they read things in English. They read Shakespeare and the English poets. And they also studied mathematics and astronomy. And in the paper, there's a quote about the amateur astronomer who has his telescope set up at the end of the field and the effect that has on the workers. So so far what I've told you is a few slices of historical fact. They're really anecdotes. And they're presented for a certain rhetorical effect. So I want to suggest that studying these great books, which are apparently useless, these old books, are really not about as far from oppressive or ideological or as promoting the values of the ruling class as could be imagined. And that's not to say that books cannot be used to oppress or to suppress or to rule, or that they weren't intended to be used that way. Think about the Bible example. But it's never been their only use, and the intentional use in that direction has never been effective, at least not completely. So what I want to ask is, in order to give my account a little more substance, a little more backing than just stories, I want to try to give a brief account of what it is exactly that might make this education liberating in the way I'm describing. What exactly might be its value? So what reality or realities underlies the stories and might drive the liberation described in them? And it's obviously my remarks are going to be very tentative, so they're meant to open up a conversation. I don't pretend that they have established anything. We can read old books for different reasons and in different ways. We can read them without really reading them to look important or distinguished in public. We can read them and then Google interesting fact nuggets, to impress others. Well, actually, this, you always start with, well, actually. We can read them looking for logical or moral flaws, for a thrill of superiority to the supposedly great minds of the past. And that's not hard to do. Old books, great books, they're full of mistakes of various kinds, like every human endeavor is. Or do we read looking for, say, useful nuggets for the struggle for justice? That's another possibility. So when I asked earlier about what's the connection between Huey Newton's reading The Republic 8 times and his speech in the courtroom, where he says, "I see in the cave, my people need a liberation." Do we think that he read looking for nuggets like that? Or do we think that there was some other change that happened in him of which that was the fruit or the outcome? So what I want to say is, I think, and in the examples I've said, the readers, the self-taught learners, they read with an eye to fundamental questions. What are the contours of the good life? What do human beings need to flourish? What is the natural world? And in what sense do we belong in it? What is the role of morality in a happy life? Is there any hope or salvation for us in extreme circumstances? Do we have any dignity beyond what's given to us by our surroundings? What is the role of justice in an adequate political community? That is, how much injustice can be borne, if any, and what are the means of remedying it? So these are fundamental questions. They're human questions. The enslaved, their children and grandchildren, had been dehumanized. So they were given by their masters a default option of an existence with a diminished humanity. But they came to the books, whether they heard them or whether they read them, by good luck, by the good fortune of being able to learn to read. And they stayed with them, I want to say, in order to discover or to recover or to build their humanity. So we can see this activity now, and I think there are two different possibilities that I can think of. I'm sure there are more ways of understanding this process. So here's one. Perhaps the wealthy rulers who ordained the classics as education for their sons, and they were sons. Perhaps they saw that a person's full humanity lay in the books, that there was freedom and power and dignity and humanity in the books. And so they wanted to make sure that all that implied, all that humanity implied, was given to their class and only their class. So their sons and no one else, or their legitimate sons and no one else. The workers, the enslaved, the left out, the marginalized, the oppressed, they saw this thing that the masters were doing, the wealthy rulers were doing, and they sought to appropriate the dignity, freedom, the power, the humanity to themselves. So to seek one's humanity and dignity in that way is a kind of act of rebellion, an act of resistance. So that's possibility one. We can also imagine, here's a second one. We can also imagine that the rulers, they're secure in their own importance. They're not worried about it. They're confident in it. And so they didn't experience these books in the same way as the readers in our stories. So I know you've read a piece of what I would call a bit later Du Bois about art. I'm going to be talking about the earlier Du Bois of The Souls of Black Folk, which is a wonderful classic I recommend to everybody. So towards the end of Souls of Black Folk, in the essay called On the Coming of John, Du Bois tells the story of a young man who leaves his small southern town to be educated in the North. And this is late 19th century, so under full Jim Crow and tons of violence. So John, this young man, during his education, attends an opera in New York City, a German opera by Wagner called Lohengrin. The music moves him profoundly. So profoundly that he unconsciously grips the armrests of his seat. He inadvertently touches the hand of a white woman, which has an effect later on. But he's so profoundly moved that he doesn't quite notice what he's doing. And he's filled with longing, this is Du Bois's account, of a way of being that is above the diminishments of his daily life. But at some point he looks around the opera house and he realizes the boredom and the indifference of the rest of the audience, that is the wealthy white audience who's surrounding him. So the suggestion I think Du Bois is making is that this music means something to him and for him that it doesn't mean for them. That is, they are not experiencing this longing that he is. They are not being transported. They are not gripping the edges of their seat in wonder and awe. Now I find this longing very interesting. What is its object, I wonder? Now Du Bois, this is before he's fully Marxist in the time that you read him. But even then, he's never a religious thinker. So for him, it's not the longing for eternal life or the longing for the beatific vision promised to Christians, where one sees God face to face. It's not the longing either of material advancement, for a better job, for an equal playing field in the competition for social status. He's very critical of vocational education, of job training education. So what else is there? What exactly is he longing for? So I'm not sure exactly how Du Bois himself would answer that question. So I'm just going to speculate a little bit. He opens each chapter of this book with snatches of music that he calls the sorrow songs. These are more commonly known as spirituals. They're the hymns of the enslaved and their descendants. And he also quotes poetry from various sources, mostly European sources, but some from the ancient Near East, the Hebrew Bible, and some from the Persian tradition. And I think it's a little puzzling why he does this, because Souls of Black Folk, among other things, includes, because Du Bois was a sociologist, it includes a detailed and rigorous account of the material conditions of Black people in the South after the war, after Reconstruction. And he gives numerous policy prescriptions and recommendations. So what does poetry have to do with anything, as far as that's concerned? Why doesn't he just make an empirical-based policy argument of the kind that you would be encouraged to do in many political theory courses or political science courses in college nowadays? So in a famous passage at the end of the essay that's called The Training of Black Men, the same book, Du Bois describes a type of communion in literature. And I think he's thinking probably, of something like the Anna Julia Cooper passage, where she describes the kind of communing with dead authors that one has when one is educated. The way he puts it is to say that Aristotle, Balzac, and Dumas offer him a conversation without contempt or diminishment. So unlike the living white people who he lives with, the dead authors of the books offer him open conversation. So he puts it, wed with truth, he dwells above the veil. The veil is the color line. The veil is the thing that divides Black Americans from white in the United States. At the end of the book, Du Bois describes the hope that he thinks is in these sorrow songs, that men will be judged one day not on the color of their skin, but on their souls. Such a hope is echoed decades later by Martin Luther King in his I Have a Dream speech, but with an interesting substitution. King dreams of the day when men will be judged not on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. Now, I wonder whether there's a difference here, that is a difference between one's soul and one's character. The soul for Du Bois, I think, is a source of longing and aspiration. It's prior to character. Character shaped by the interaction between one's deepest desires and one's circumstances. So under the oppressive circumstances that Du Bois describes and diagnoses, one's longing may turn to a fierce competitive spirit with the rulers, as he describes in himself, or bitterness or despair or anger that he sees in others behind the veil. But in the realm of art, music, poetry, and philosophy for him, this is in his early work. It's interesting to think about what happened to him before he wrote the thing that you guys read. But in this realm, soul meets with soul. So in our longings and aspirations, we find the ground of our human unity or our common humanity. And it's in this, I think, that Du Bois places his hope. That is not in God, not in material success, but in this meeting of soul to soul that happens in art, music, literature, philosophy, etc. In time, Du Bois's vision of human unity becomes explicitly Marxist in character. So because it's Marxist, he believes that history is developing in such a way that an international, interracial proletariat working class is going to rise, and all things will be held in common. For Martin Luther King, human unity is imagined in the beloved community, which is a community that evolves when a certain critical mass of people become committed to nonviolence. For other Christian thinkers like Dorothy Day, human unity is the body of Christ. It's a supernatural union of love and sacrifice that binds each of us with one another. So an old book, a great book, the kind of thing that one encounters in liberal education is it's an act of communication. It consists in one human being, the author, speaking to another as an equal. It's an invitation into a conversation on that basis. And this can be paradoxical or surprising. So Plato and Aristotle, great Greek philosophers who I spent a lot of time studying, and I gather Professor Glasscock has also, they didn't believe that all human beings were equal. They thought that only a few people could really understand what was going on and were really worthy of all the kind of education that fully developed a human being. But they wrote for their equals And that means that anyone can pick up their book and be invited as an equal to the conversation that they engage them with. So in a funny way, despite their elitism, these thinkers guaranteed themselves a role in social movements of liberation, which they themselves would have found unimaginable and might have rejected if they'd known about them. How should we understand these modes of community that common learning makes available? This is my last question. It's going to be how I end. How should we understand these modes of community, these modes of connection that we have with authors or with one another through books? Should we understand them as an imminent development of history, the liberation of working people of all races and backgrounds? That's the Marxist view of the late Du Bois. Should we understand them as bonds built on the grace of God, who builds his kingdom on earth in this way? I think that might be something like the vision of King. Is there a third or a fourth option where we consider our connection to one another as an essential part of our being a part of a social group or a political unit? Is it part of being Americans, or part of being Georgians, or part of being whatever community that we judge ourselves to belong to? Or do we suspend judgment as to all these ultimate questions and just treasure this kind of friendship or connection for its own sake? So these are the sorts of questions that I hope that you yourselves will undertake in your studies. And I'm not going to try to attempt an answer, but I would be very happy to hear your thoughts about this or anything else that I've said today or that you read in my work, or anything else that you think I might be interested in talking about. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Zena. That was awesome. Lots to think about. I actually realized that kind of in my enthusiasm to hear your talk, I didn't say kind of what the format was going to be. So I think everybody who's in my classes has been promoted to panelists. So that means that you can unmute yourselves by yourselves. You're going to have priority, so you're a student in the class to ask questions. I think the easiest way would be to go with the hand option, but maybe if you have something kind of like, I don't know how you feel about this, Zena, if like they can just jump in if it's kind of something where you're like, okay, cool, to have a little bit more of a flowing conversation if that's possible. Maybe I'll start just to give people time to kind of formulate their questions, just to kind of put the 3 questions that you have given to us so that we can engage with those. So the first question, which is motivated kind of by your reflection on the life stories of Malcolm X and Hugh Newton, is both of these people saw in the works that they read, these classical works, and specifically with Newton, you mentioned his quote about the cave, and the many times that he read the Republic. He says, so I have from the quote, I'm misquoting, but it's something like, I saw in Plato's cave that my people were in need of liberation. And your question there was, if you've read the Republic, we've only read, so in the class, just to fill you in, we've read a couple of chunks. So we read The Cave, was the first thing that we read. And that was kind of our introduction to philosophy. And then we read a little bit of the criticisms of democracy. So we've actually read the chunks that you could see most evidently why it would connect. But, you know, like, just to fill in the students. So the Republic is this massive book, as I've emphasized, and there's reflection on how you should educate people, what the connection is between music and mathematics, what the basic structure of the human soul is. what's the nature of justice, of course, is kind of the guiding question. And there's a bunch that kind of, it's unclear, like, how are we going to have kind of textiles in the life of the city? And it's like, okay, and he spends a number of times. So it's this large book, and it seems as though the whole book, reading, he read the whole book 8 times. How is it that a book kind of this large with topics covering the nature of knowledge, the nature of the human soul, how it is possible to kind of commute with higher things for Plato as the forms, and this thing, the form of the good? How is that a book like that is the kind of thing that for Newton highlights a certain form, the need for liberation? Okay, so that's question 1. Question 2, you gave us kind of 2 options to think about what it is that happens when people that have been subjugated to injustices, and specifically kind of the central example have been African-American slaves. What is it that happens that kind of leads to a certain form of kind of recognition of humanity and the self-respect that there are, such that kind of leads to movements of liberation? And one option that you put forth is, look, intellectual works, they're being shared precisely as the kind of like the highest achievements in a human life. And so, and that's why they were kind of mainly restricted to the sons of slave owners. And then it's an act of revelry to just engage in reading these things. You're sharing in kind of this highest achievements. And I take it kind of what's important about this, kind of in contrast to the second option, which I'll mention in a second, is that they're both kind of, both groups are getting the same thing from these books. The second option is that actually they're not getting the same thing. They're not just getting to share kind of this highest intellectual pursuits, because there's actually something that might be missed by people that read these books with a kind of security, a secure sense of their own importance. And this is the point that you want to kind of highlight as to how you might get something like this from the experience of the character in The Coming of John and Du Bois's story in The Souls of Black Folks, where it seems as though there's something different that he gets precisely because of the subjugation that he's been put to. And then the third question was about how to understand kind of the way in which this book's, I'm not quite clear that so feel free to correct me. So it seems as though this book—
You've been doing amazing, like you're an amazing listener. So I'm already like pulled over and how well you've heard it. So if you, yeah, it's probably my fault if the last—
No. So the third question is, it seems as though kind of these books create a certain kind of social bonds between the different readers, and also between, so both kind of readers and also kind of reader and writer. And we see this kind of in the ways in which this is a communion with Pascal and Socrates and so on. The question is, how is it that it shapes this kind of communion between amongst readers and amongst reader and writer, and kind of what's the nature of this bond? I'm not sure that I get kind of the full question, so feel free to elaborate on that one.
So thank you. So I think the last question, and we can focus on whatever question people would like, but the last question is just, if there's this recognition of humanity in the books, and so a kind of communication between one human being and another, which could mean that you're having conversations, as Du Bois or Cooper described, with the authors, or whether you also, through reading the same books, talk with others about it. And this seems like some piece of the liberation. You know, you discover humanity in dehumanizing circumstances. you recognize your humanity as something special to be longed for rather than just something that's given to you from birth. And that I was trying to connect, this is maybe a little bit out of the main point of the paper, but I was thinking about what kind of community that might be. And Du Bois, when he becomes a Marxist, has this vision of the universal proletariat, the universal working class, like rising up and holding all things in common. And King has the beloved community, this community where those who believe in nonviolence are united. And then there's other, so there's Christian versions of it. There's all kinds of, or there's, maybe this is just what we hold in common together because we live together. We happen to live together as citizens. Or maybe it's something that we have in common, and we don't really know why, but it's great while it lasts. So let's just enjoy it while we can. That was my last question.
Cool. Yeah. Good. So just to kind of summarize in my own words. So what's the nature of this bond that books create, and kind of how do they fit with this visions of a certain kind of community that these different writers? Excellent. Cool. And there was a lot more in the talk, so I want to invite anybody to either kind of jump in if they have thoughts about these questions or anything else in the talk. There can be clarificatory questions, objections, kind of ask for applications that they might have to different cases that they might be thinking about, and so on. So maybe at this point, I'm going to open the room. So if you have a question, please use the raise hand option and I'll start calling on people. Whether I'm going to just keep a list. So as I said, I'll prioritize students, but anybody can jump in. Any thoughts? Brooke.
I just want to say thank you so much. First off, that was truly a wonderful lecture. I think what's so interesting about what you said is we are in a time of such polarization, and the way you talk about, old artifacts of intelligence, such as these books on philosophy, you almost think nowadays, I can't consume something that has anything to do with racism. I can't consume anything that has to do with classism. I can't consume any of those things because I don't want to uphold any of them. But the way you were talking about intelligence as a more independent concept, like away from all the conflicts we're having today, but also so involved in the conflicts we're having today, was very interesting to me. And I was wondering how you feel about, for example, Wagner. He was a composer. I'm a music major, so I've learned a bit about him. He's not a good person. He was never a good person. I'm pretty sure he supported Hitler, those kinds of things, but we still enjoy his music. And I was wondering what your thoughts are on that, as consuming things that may have, the person who created them may have had a bad moral compass.
So thank you for that question. And I actually hadn't even though it fits with the theme of the talk, I had not even thought about the bigger question with Wagner. So I think he might have been dead by the rise of Hitler, but I think his music was kind of the soundtrack of the Nazis. So it's seen by many to form the culture that led to Nazism. And there's anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish stuff in the operas. So that's feeding into the climate of anti-Semitism that leads to the extermination of so many millions of Jews and others. And I honestly, speaking for myself, I think Wagner's an incredible composer, and I'm never quite comfortable when I'm listening to it. Partly because of the style of the music, which is like, all about longing. Like, it's not by chance that Du Bois picks it. It's like longing, 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 and there's never, there's hardly resolution. So it's partly the nature of the music, but it's partly that I feel, or I think I feel, that moral contagion that's in it. But I've learned a ton from listening to Wagner or seeing the operas. And I think that music, in a way, is a harder example because I think it affects us more deeply, as you know from reading the. If you've read the Republic, you'll know there's all about that. It affects you very deeply at a level that's not your rationality can't necessarily reach to. But even so, you can learn a lot and you can grow from it as if you have these habits of reflection. If you're a person who cultivates your own freedom and independence, you don't have to be carried away from that. And if you feel that the effect is bad on you, you can freely choose not to listen to it. But I think I love these stories about the old books because it's not just that somehow, as me with Wagner, like there's discomfort but there's learning. So I decide to live with it because it's worth it to me. You actually just get an effect that's opposite of what the author might have intended. So like Plato and Aristotle, like they're writing for a tiny, tiny group of people. You know, they think only the Greeks are capable of doing philosophy. I mean, they look down not on say brown or black people. They look down on the Northern Europeans, who they just think are the most savage, just appalling race of humans on the earth. But anyway, they think in terms of race. They think that their race is the best. They think that most people are stupid and incapable of thinking. But because they write for their equals, their books, once they're dead and gone, are open to anyone who can read them. And they get invited in as equals. And so someone like, I don't think Huey Newton, when he's reading the Republic, at least not on his account, he doesn't say, oh, I struggled, it was uncomfortable because it was written by someone. He's just like, oh yeah, this is for me. And I'm going to use this book to become the person who I want to be. So there's just, especially with books, a ton of freedom that a reader brings. Not only brings to it, but then continues to reap from it. So I think I don't think we should ignore the moral compromise. I think we should seek to know everything about these people and what it meant. We should think through every part of their books. You don't want to like just censor out the stuff that's offensive or wrong. You want to know that it's there, and then you have to ask a question. Well, how could someone like Plato, who saw like these incredible possibilities for human beings that no one had seen before, or like no one, at least, no one in his tradition had seen before, how did he also think that no one else could, that like most people in the world just weren't capable of doing this and were better off just like growing food for the philosophers to eat? I mean, how did he think that? It's very hard to understand, but it's an important question to ask. Because anyone, I don't know, that's enough to say. I'll leave more space for others to pick up the question, or you can come back at me if you like.
Maybe what I'll do after each question is I'll just see if anybody has just follow-ups and they can just jump in, and otherwise I'll just continue down a list that I'm keeping. So any follow-ups, feel free to just kind of jump in, unmute yourself and just ask. Brooke, of course, you can follow up if you have.
I was going to, separate from what I'd raised my hand for, but I was going to kind of jump on that a little bit. I do think that, there is, in a sense, almost more value to the work when you look at what the work itself is speaking to, and then also kind of juxtapose that as to like what was going on with the author. So I think of also looking at other examples in music. Obviously, so one of the things that came to mind was Michael Jackson. Obviously, the outstanding allegations themselves are controversial as to whether or not they're true. But, for the sake of this conversation, let's assume that they're true. He's the king of pop. Like, there is obviously tons of merit to talking about his work and, discussing it and whatnot. And then on the other case of books, I also thought of, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting the name. This is embarrassing. Cthulhu guy.
Oh,
Lovecraft. Yeah, with Lovecraft, I think like at the same time well, I guess maybe it's a bit different from Plato, because kind of his, in a sense, his personal views kind of permeate his work a lot more. But I think that there's a ton of merit to that, to kind of looking at the two in tandem.
So I think that's true. It's interesting though that there is a difference between Wagner and Michael Jackson, not just in terms of genre, but that I can't hear any of Michael Jackson's personal situation in the music. Or the dancing for that matter. It seems like something different. And I think there's something to be said, especially in the more contemporary context, for like, there's matters for the law, or matters for God's judgment or whatever. And then there's matters for appreciating the work. And those can be separated sometimes. And sometimes they can't, So Wagner, I think, was tough because it does a bit permeate it. It permeates it because of the role of the author, and it permeates it because of what it meant in the broader culture that he wrote for. But I think that I believe that there is such a thing as a great book or a great work of music or a great artist. It's controversial, but I do believe that. I think part of what that means is that you're writing or you're composing not just for a narrow purpose, but for a broader human purpose. So somehow you tap into something broadly human and not just some narrow thing that you're trying to get done. So I don't think like, racist tracts from, the 1920s, like old KKK pamphlets. Like, I don't think, let's read these for their human value. I think, you know what, give that to historians so that they know what people used to think. Or maybe what's influencing people now, but let's not pretend that this is somehow worthy of our this doesn't educate us the way that Plato's Republic does. And so the examples of the things that the people read, I think, matter, that Newton read the Republic, or that Malcolm X read like the whole library. He reads like all of these classics, all of these tomes from all different times and places. And that's where the education comes in. It's not just and that tells me that I think there's something in these books or in these works that can break free to some extent of an immoral context. That doesn't mean we should pretend it doesn't exist, but it means that we can be more fearless about it, I think.
Jose.
Okay, thank you, and I'm still really thankful to be here and listen to this talk. So I have a couple questions. One is a question, and the other is just I would like to hear your opinion. So the first question is you said that intellectual work is a way to human beings to flourish, but how to prevent a different kind of humanity? How to prevent misunderstanding in great books? For example, some people have seen justification for slavery in the Bible, for example. Other people uses Darwin theory of evolution for social engineering, for example. And you mentioned Nietzsche, and some people find justification for Nazism in Nietzsche's work. So how to prevent this different kind of humanity coming from great books? And second, I would like to hear your opinion about why most of the academic institutions, they only pick great classics from the Western world, but what about the Eastern world? So, and this is something that Professor Juan did it in class. He picked a couple essays to read from the Buddhist thinkers and the Hindu thinkers, and this, I think there's wonderful ideas over there also to take advantage of those knowledge. Okay, and thank you.
Sure, those are both terrific questions. So first of all, the question about how do you prevent the books being read for bad reasons? So, if I were trying to make the opposite point, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to give not just stories, but a little bit of an account in the lecture, is that, you know, the slave owners not only thought the Bible justified slavery, but they also loved their Greeks, because the Greeks talked about slavery and they talked about how it was all right. So they clearly read these books and got something different out of them. Now, I think if you looked, this is just a guess. I haven't done this hard work. My guess is that if you looked carefully at what they're doing when they're reading those books, like they are looking for rationalizations for stuff that they want to do. So I don't think anyone became a slave owner because they read Aristotle or because they read the Bible. I don't think that's how it works. I think you become a slave owner either because it's profitable for you, or because everyone else is doing it, or both. You know, it's the way to advance, you know, in the South of a certain time. It's like, well, what you do, if you're wealthy, this is what you do. And then once you do it, and what I suspect personally is that there's a certain amount of something has to happen to you on the inside for you to be able to do that. So you start rationalizing, you know, so you're like, oh, look, this book says slavery's good, you know. Forget all this stuff about God bringing the Hebrews out of Egypt. You know, that's irrelevant. What really matters is the part where it says, you know, slaves obey your masters. So I'm inclined to think that when there are good and bad reading, like that rationalizing is not a good way of reading, and you have to be open to it. But even that aside, so that's one way we might think about it. But you might not buy all of that, because there's a lot of assumptions built into the line of thinking I just suggested. I think the other way to think about it is this, which is a little more frightening, frankly, but I think there might be some truth in it too. That when I talk about a free and independent reader, you know, one who you know, which is what these, you know, Newton or Malcolm X or these people, or Frederick Douglass, they found from their education, from their books, their own identity, their own way of being, their own way of thinking, their own judgment about what was right and what was wrong, what was possible, what was impossible. That doesn't always go in one direction. You know, you can't determine the answers to it. That's part of what is both incredible but also frightening about it. That is, you can, with your freedom, with your independence, with your judgment, you can become a terrible person. And part of me thinks, well, it might be good to prevent that. There might be some things we can do to do that. For instance, we can encourage in our classrooms open-ended reading rather than like look for the agenda, like means to end. And that I think will give you some hope of actually seeing humanity in it and then connecting with others and so on. So there's little things you can try to do, but you're never going to be able to keep people from becoming the people who they choose to be. And beyond that, then you have to think about what's the political solution for if it becomes a movement, if it becomes, you know, then you have to think on the political level and not about education anymore. That's the first question. And the second question about the sort of which books should be read, you know, should it be just the European classics or should it be from all traditions? I'll say a couple. So I don't think anyone serious, I mean, there might be people out there, I don't want to, but I'm going to call them unserious. No one's going to deny that there are a variety of great traditions that produce amazing books. So there's the Chinese tradition, there's the Indian tradition, there's, and one of the things that's gotten distorted in the teaching of the European tradition the past couple hundred years is that they've cut away, in my view, its connections to other cultures. So if you think about the origins of what we call Western literature, which is a lot of it in Jewish traditions or in Christian traditions, which are originally from the Near East. And Christianity is in Africa before it's ever in Northern Europe. It's in Egypt and Ethiopia. It goes all through the Near East. It goes to India very early on. And then the Western philosophical tradition is actually transmitted in the Middle East through Syriac and then through Arabic and then into Europe. So it's, if you look at what a tradition is a connection between some books. It's books that refer to one another. So that's what a canon is. So there's a Chinese tradition, there's an Indian tradition. These are all books that refer to one another. And if you look at carefully what's called the Western tradition, it actually reaches out not just in its colonial influence, but in its origins from all over the world. So I would like it to be thought of more that way. I do think teaching connections between books is important. So you can learn a lot from just dwelling with the books that go to ancient Greece and Rome and the religious texts that are connected to them that go back into the Near East and to Africa. I think you can learn a ton from doing that. And I don't think a lifetime can do everything. One thing that I've always been reluctant to do is to cherry pick things from a tradition that I don't know much about, and without looking at what it means in that tradition, without really having a sense from people who've lived it, what the culture is and what the background assumptions are. I think that's honestly behind a certain amount of what you see as the narrowness of the canons that are presented. A lot of it is people not wanting to treat something superficially and them teaching the things that they know that they were taught. But that's not to say that we shouldn't all be interested in anything human and just go after all these traditions and follow them to the bottom, because there's just no shortage of incredible stuff to learn from all the traditions.
I'm actually gonna, so people can follow up on this thread, but I want to make sure that Gabriel gets to ask his question. He's been waiting for a long time. So Gabriel, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you for coming to speak to us. It was a very great presentation. I learned a lot. And my question is, so when you look at these Black free thinkers, these liberators, they're always looked at in a positive light. Like now recently, they were always classified in this category. They were Marxists, so they had a Marxist theory. But they were looked at it in a positive light. But the category of Marxism now in recent days is always looked down upon, is always put in a negative connotation. So my question is, what is like the positive aspects of Marxism, and how did these thinkers like Huey Newton or Du Bois, how did they put the positive aspects on Marxism? Because I'm inclined to agree with them, but when you look at Marxism as a whole, it's always looked down upon. I just want to hear, how is there a positive aspect to that kind of thinking, if there's any?
Well, so that's an amazing question. I'm not a Marxist myself. What I find is there's a lot to be learned from thinking about the influence of social class on the way things are, and how people make money, and how that affects social class, social divisions, what race is, what race isn't. I mean, I also think that honestly, in the Black American tradition, it was the Marxists who were, in the 20th century especially, really like going to the mat for racial equality, especially social equality. So my understanding is the abolitionists, American abolitionists in the 19th century, they were ending slavery, but they didn't want like people marrying one another. They didn't want social equality. And it was the Marxists who really brought that into consciousness, as something that we should expect and want. So in that way, they're really behind the civil rights movement and all the stuff that came after that, which is really about social equality. So I don't think, Marxism has a checkered history like everything else, but I think if you really, when I've looked at the varieties of influence it's had some very positive influences. And given how stubborn the situation has been for Black Americans and how hard it has been to make progress at various points, and or the progress is made and then it gets taken back. I don't think you can blame anyone for turning to radicalism. You know, it's a natural thought. You're like, none of this accommodation stuff is working. You know, we need to be thinking on a bigger scale. I think that's what you're seeing at various threads throughout that Black political tradition. You're just seeing people who are saying, like, look, trying to get along is not working. Let's think big. And not just the people who are thinking big and who really care about abolishing racial division. And so you're going to turn to those people. I don't know. Does that help a little bit? Like, I don't know.
It does, because it seems like in a time where you always taking one step forward and 3 steps back, it's like you can't blame somebody to turning to that kind of thinking. But like, I'm not saying like I'm not Marxist either, but I just feel like people shouldn't just generalize it into just like one thing as like somebody who's a brutal dictator. I think like Marxism thinking has inspired a lot of great leaders out there to push for the Black people's advancement, or colored people's advancement, or the poor people's advancement. People like Hugh and Newton, people like Fred Hampton, people like other people like Du Bois. Like it's pushed a lot of good policies. Like, yet, like you offer a moderate solution, and not a lot of people is going to meet that moderate solution. It's when you offer a radical solution, people is going to be like, okay,
right,
I'm gonna go there, but I'm gonna meet you. I'm gonna meet you somewhere in the middle. And
yeah.
I feel like that's how the positive effects of Marxism has had for Black people and other people.
I think that's right, and it's not just civil rights and Black liberation. It's also the labor movement. I mean, you know, we had child labor, you know, in the 19th century, early 20th century. You know, we didn't have weekends. They didn't have any idea of a 40-hour week. I mean, that's all being, you know, eroded right now. But people fought and died for that stuff, and a lot of them were Marxists. And I don't know what they would have done, frankly, without the Marxists. So anyway, that's not to whitewash any of the really bad things that were done in Marxism, but I agree with you. There's just a ton to be learned from it, and I think it's definitely worthy of study, and especially these thinkers, I think, who really tried to live it out in the world in a certain way, and not just to follow the central command or whatever in the Soviet Union.
I think just to add a quick note, and then Tommy will have the last question. One thing I've gotten a little bit interested in is the way in which Marx kind of appropriates and transforms and does things with Aristotelian philosophy, and in particular with this distinction that's crucial to Aristotle between praxis and between production and action proper. And for him, kind of like the central criticism of, well, one of the central criticisms of capitalism is that it turns everything into a form of production, whereas for Aristotle and kind of for the tradition, it has always been subsumed to this kind of to praxis proper, to action proper. And on the other hand, there's this kind of tension that you see kind of in things like I really dislike this part of the thesis on Feuerbach when he goes, the philosophers have been trying to describe the world. The point is to change it. And it's like, why can't it be the point to do both?
Well, I always take comfort in that piece. It's in German Ideology, I think, where he talks about how the real dream is for people to live like lives of leisure where they can fully develop themselves as human beings. You know, so there's all kinds of Marx, but I'm with you too on that. That's not my favorite part.
Okay.
Of course, it wouldn't be.
Tommy, you got the last question.
It's actually not really a question, but more so a comment, I think, on that I actually found wraps up, I guess, our little Zoom call pretty well. First of all, thank you. I take a lot of influence from Professor Glasscock, first of all, and thank you, Ms. Hitz, for coming to speak with us. I wanted to speak on what got me to comment, actually, was Jose's topic, the second topic about how the Western type of how Western views and Western ideals and Western teachings are actually like what we grow up with. And I wanted to connect that kind of to the beginning here, Ms. Hiltz's first question about Plato's cave and how it connects with Malcolm X and how he talked about oppression in that sense. But I want to start off with by saying that the choice of educational institutions here in this country to teach Western ways of thinking is kind of connected to Plato's cave as how society dictates what we see up until we leave the cave. And I think that higher education, as Plato would say, is leaving the cave. And so in high school, we're all taught, at least here, we're all taught the same way, that the obvious example, Christopher Columbus came over and he did all these great things only for us to come over here and to college and I got a slap in the face. Oh, he did such terrible, I don't even feel comfortable speaking about it because just how he, like the things that he did to Native American people and just wiped them out. And so I feel like gaining education and leaving the cave, in a sense, I guess the cave, for me, how I see it is an epistemic bubble. I wrote about it in one of my foreign exchange essays, where by leaving America, I'm leaving this epistemic bubble that I've grown up with and that I've grown comfortable with. Even though I'm gaining knowledge through college, I'm still like gaining just different perspectives all the time, but it's from one culture. And so by leaving the country, going to a different nation, I'll be able to see how those different influences of society are building up those people. But at the same time, because Western teachings like here are very prioritized in at least like the comeuppance of children in lower education, looking at how some other countries, I mean, if it's one country's like choice to educate their citizens on their own culture, that's one thing. But then also, I feel like as a society, we're all kind of stuck in the whole Plato's cave thing where we're just, this is how we've grown up and this is how we choose to see life until we actually grow out of it and take different people's influences and different people's experiences and incorporate it into the knowledge that we have, and then build our own self and build our own understanding from those things. I feel like just in direct relation to Plato's cave and Malcolm's speaking on oppression and connection to Plato's cave, I feel like the narrative is that society has built, or I won't say society, but white society has built the system of oppression in order to keep people in the cave. And as people start to speak out, that's where all of this conflict is coming up as for nowadays. And so I feel like it's important, the education of us, in order to take from these different narratives and build our own different perspectives in order to better the world through our education, which I don't know, I guess kind of ties back to the reading that we had to read for class. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I love what you said about I think you said better than I did, this process of entering other perspectives and then becoming more of who you are, seeing the world in the way, like integrating your experiences, different experiences into a new way of life. That's perfect. So thank you so much for your comment. I appreciate it.
All right. At this point, I'd like to thank, well, our speaker, but also everybody who asked questions and who participated in different ways. For my students, on Wednesday we have a test, but then maybe we can pick up some of these threads if you want at the beginning of class for our last class on Monday. And so other than that, I would just like to say thank you to our speaker, Zena Hitz, for a wonderful talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your wonderful questions. Amazing, like perfect.
Andrew, do you need to say anything to close things up? You're muted.
Rookie mistake. Let me echo the thanks to Dr. Hitz for joining us and for leading a very stimulating discussion. And also allow me to please remind everybody that our final installment of the speaker series for the Jean Beer Blumenfeld Center for Ethics will be this Wednesday, April 21st from 1 until 2:15 p.m. Eastern Time, featuring Jennifer Morton discussing pessimism traps, the limits of epistemic resilience. Y'all can get details about that at ethics.gsu.edu. Thank you all very much, and I hope you all have a great day. And to the professor's students, I hope you all do well on that test next time.
All right, Zena, we'll see you later for the other session. Excellent. All right. Bye, everybody.
Professor, are we required to go to classes Wednesday?